Alright, so we're going to be doing a PS2 game collection. Now I have 34 PlayStation 2 games. Now it's going to be a long video. It's going to be freaking epic. Now let's take a look at those. Now I'm going to tell you which work and which does not work. Most of them work. First off is Cars. It works perfectly fine. No issues whatsoever. There's the disc. Now let's move on to our next game. Next up is Madden NFL 2005. It works perfectly fine. No issues whatsoever. Here's the game. Next up is Major League Baseball 2K5. It works perfectly fine. No issues whatsoever. I have the PlayStation 2 disc and the DVD disc. Both of those work perfectly fine. Now let's move on to our next game. Next up is NASCAR 2005 Championship Cup. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. And it has a PS1 memory card in it. Next up is NCAA Football 2004. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever, but there is a damaged part to the case. Next up is Tiger Woods PGA Tour 2003. It works perfectly fine, but it does not load the game. And it can only play trailers and the menu and the intro. But I was able to do that video, the intro, in 2018. Now let's move on to our next game. Next up is LEGO Star Wars 2, the original trilogy. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Metal Gear Solid 2. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is NASCAR 08. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. There it is. And notice it says Kevin's on it because it used to be his, but now he gave it to me, which is nice of him. Now let's move on to our next game. Next up is Jeep Thrills. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever, but the case is in bad condition. You see that? There's the compact disc. Now let's move on to our next game. Next up is NHL 2004. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is The Simpsons Road Rage. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. And it's my first ever Simpsons game. Next up is Grand Theft Auto Vice City. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. It works, but has some problems. Yeah, having a lot of problems reading this disc. Here's San Andreas. Yeah, it does have this memory card right on it, which is so cool. Now let's move on to our next game. Next up is Grand Theft Auto Vice City Stories. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever, but it's in the PlayStation 2 right now, so I'm going to show you. Here it is, Grand Theft Auto Vice City Stories on PlayStation 2. Now let's move on to our next game. Next up is Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Here it is. Next up, I have two Grand Theft Auto 3s. Both of them work, but only this one had a couple problems with reading the disc. But otherwise, it works. Yeah, this one works. It's my first ever PlayStation 2 game. Now, let's move on to our next PlayStation 2 game. Next up is NCAA Football 2007. It does not work. I tried. Yeah, it did not work due to some loading issues. Now, let's move on to our next game. Next up is Mortal Kombat Armageddon. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. It's my first ever Mortal Kombat game for the PlayStation 2. It's one of my first Mortal Kombat games for the next generation consoles. Now let's move on to our next game. Next up is Madden NFL 2010. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Tiger Woods PGA Tour 2006. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is The Sims 2. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Super Trucks Racing. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever, but it's a compact disc. Next up is Final Fantasy X. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. It's my first Final Fantasy game. Next up is NASCAR 2007. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Tiger Woods PGA Tour 2004. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is NBA Live 2006. Yeah, my tablet fell over. Sorry for the inconvenience. But it works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Narja, the Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Let's continue with the video. Next up is MX World Tour. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. It's a compact disc. Now let's move on to our next PlayStation 2 game. Sorry for all this yelling, but just trying to keep it going. Next up is Ice Age 2 The Meltdown. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Lego Star Wars, the video game. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. It's a compact disc. Next up is Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. And last but not least is NCAA March Madness 2005. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Yeah. Alright, we have 34 PlayStation 2 games, of 33 working ones, and 1 non-working PlayStation 2 games, which is NCAA Football 2007. Yeah, all in work except for that game. Now, that's going to do with me for the updated PlayStation 2 collection. It's a long video. This is Dad's account. Thank you for watching. I hope you like, subscribe, and comment. See you again in the next video for more of your favorite reviews, compilation videos, camera tests, and more.